Okay, so I apologize for the lack of videos this last month. I've been swamped with client work, but I figure since I have some free time today, we'll do a video on how to use some of the tools that I built and how they work. This will be beneficial for people even if you don't have my Patreon toolkit. It's available for $5 on Patreon, and it's as simple as just downloading it and then throwing it in your OTLS folder. So once you do that, you would just right click and you'll see this easy tab, and you should have all the easy stuff in there. So the first kind of toolkit that I'm going to go over is the destruction process. To start out, I'm just going to drop a pig head, turn off the shader, geometry easy. And I'm also going to visualize wires, move them up. I'm just going to give them one subdivision also, give them a little bit of resolution because the geometry you're using probably won't be that light. So the first tool in the easy destruction setup is the easy fracture. And this is the one you want to use for your initial fracture. Now this tool uses a Boolean workflow, and there's a lot of issues with Boolean actually if you were to just do this any other way. The nice part about Boolean is that you get these kind of cuts where if you were to do a Voronoi, so now you can see that we have all these cuts, but they're all straight. You can use this workflow. I'll show you it right here just anyways. You can drop a rest node before this. Let's do an attribute noise, and I'll use the position. This is what it's looking like now, and I'll actually go ahead and I'll scatter the points on here. And so then when you fracture it, you're fracturing it in this space. So if you drop a wrangle node and go at p equals at rest, it's going to do its best to bring it back to that position, and you get these nice curves. However, you also, in a lot of cases, either have to mess with this a ton to get a value that doesn't give you bad topology, or you have to fix the topology later, and that can be a headache. So I decided to use Boolean fracture for this. And Boolean fracturing, and it's going to cut this geometry. If I drop an exploded view, it's going to cut this geometry with our grid. And we can do things like if I give this some more resolution and I give it a mountain, we can get nice curves with this, and it's pretty inexpensive. Problem you're going to run into is sometimes with this setup, you can do things like this, where you get half fractures that can cause a lot of issues. And I built this node to kind of not have that happen. So I'll show you how it's working and what it's doing. So even if you don't have the toolkit, you can create something like it. I would highly suggest just, I mean, it's $5 on my Patreon. I would suggest just going and getting the pack because I put a lot of work into these. I even made these nice little icons on there for you guys, or for me. That might be more for me. But so if I plug this into the easy fracture, you'll see that it's going to fracture a bunch with Boolean. And if I turn off the color, just kind of flat shaded, you can see that we're not able to see any difference between this and the fracture geometry, unlike back here where we'll get these edges. Now I'll go over some of the settings in here. I'm going to turn back on the color, and the cutting surface count is how many fractures is actually going to do. So the more of these that we have, the more detail we're going to get out of this thing. So, I mean, you can keep cranking this up. You're going to start getting some smaller pieces, and it's going to start also taking longer. So I'm going to bring this back down just for the sake of showing you some of the stuff. The amplitude here is going to change here. It might be better if I visualize the cutter geo for this. So just checked on this cutter geo visualization. The amplitude is going to increase, the amplitude of our noise. The frequency is going to, increasing this is going to basically densen how much detail we're getting in this stuff. Bringing it down is going to basically smooth it out almost. The resolution tab is going to control how much resolution this cutter gets. So the more resolution you get, the more detail you're going to get in your fractures, like the edges of your fractures, but it's also going to take quite a bit longer. Kind of find a happy medium. I usually find it's not crazy important to go super low with this. So I'll go ahead, control middle mouse button, click just to reset these back to normal. I'll turn off the visualize cutter geometry, and just to show you what that looks like on here, it's going to take a second. Okay, and now that it's done, you can see we have a lot of really nice details, or fine details in this edges. And that's great, but it did take quite a bit longer. This would be something I would run kind of if you need it. It's really not going to be a big deal, especially if you're looking at something from pretty far away. The defaults are usually pretty fine. Okay, and so the roughness is just going to kind of increase or decrease the smoothness of this noise that you got going on here. Lastly, there's this fall off, which is a big thing that I created to make sure that we're not getting any weird half fractures. And the way this works, so I'll actually go ahead and I'll open this up to kind of dive in and show you what's happening in here. It's bringing in our geometry or pig head. And I actually did this initially on the pig head, so I think it's best to run a match size on the pig head. So I say, okay, whatever is coming in here, which is our fractal geometry, make sure it's the same size as the pig head and centered. But basically what it's doing is then it creates a sphere around whatever we bring in after it's been match size and everything. And then it takes the sphere, scales it up by 2 so that it's big enough. I think I actually just run it through another sphere because I'm lazy. Make it a polygon, and then I clip it at the center, blast out that center, group the edges, polyfill that, and then group that. So I have this sphere that goes right through the center of this pig head. And it's plenty big enough. So, and then I remesh it, and then I give it some normals. And then in here, I am transforming around the pivot point, which is 0. And I'm basically rotating these all random orientations multiplied by the iteration of this loop, which this loop is how many cutters you're going to have. And then I run this through a distance from the sphere. And so that's where we're getting that fall off from. And then inside of this point vop, I'm displacing it basically along the normal based off of a noise so that it's only going forward and backward and we're not getting any weird side cuts. Then after that, I am actually remeshing this again just to make sure that it's clean and evenly kind of has clean even topology. After that, then we run this into the Boolean fracture. So you can see now that since I think I'm only doing, I'm just doing a single pass because I have all the visualized color Geo does is change the output and make it single pass. So if I was to turn this off, you can see now we have a bunch of these cutters, all with different setups. We can change the seed of this if we don't like the look of this. So if I change the seed up here, it's going to change. So if I change the seed over here, you can see that it's going to change the look of our cutter geo. Now, the one issue with this is that it is always going to cut from the center, and that is on purpose. It's a fallback of the HDA, but it's on purpose because you're not going to get any issues with stuff cutting halfway through because of this workflow. And usually it's going to work, it's going to look fine. So it's going to create the cuts here. It's going to output everything that you need. And then it's going to take that match size and bring it all back up to the correct scale and then correctly where it was at. So if I visualize color geo, if I start playing with this ramp, you can control the fall off from the edge of this pig head. So that is how this works. I'm going to go into a few other settings of this now here though. If I disable the visualize color geo, now I'm just looking at the cut up pieces. If I go over to the visualize tab, I have an exploded view option in here. It's going to blow this up a little bit. I'm also going to change the background to light just so we can see things a little bit easier. Okay, so one thing we can do is we have this interior detail. And what this interior detail is it's really just this RBD interior detail node, except there's one feature that I don't think a lot of people use or really realize is vital to this node working. And all this does is if I plug this in here and then I run an exploded view, so you can see the insides of this, is going to give detail on these interior edges. Also going to turn off the color just so you might be able to see this better. And if I go something like 0.05, you can now start to see that we are getting some detail on the inner faces of these cuts. Is that if you bring this down and if I change the flat shaded, you'll see that we're getting some weird topology issues here at the top. And most people don't use this last option here, which is the optional SDF for depth sampling. And I will run a BDB from polygons. It needs to take your fractured geometry and then it's going to plug it in there. The more divisions you give this, or like the higher resolution, typically the better your results. And you'll see as soon as you plug that in, you're not getting any more of those topology issues. And that's because it's taking this sample. It's like it's giving each little area a piece of depth here. And it's saying if your deformation is this close to the edge, then clamp it and do not let it deform. So you're still getting these edge details in here, but you're not getting really any of that surface kind of deformations here, but you still are getting those details on the inside. And this is built in to my HDA with good default settings. So if I go to interior detail and I just check it on, usually honestly that's enough, and let it run for a second. This is going to take a second. The out results are pretty nice. that looks a lot better than the flat edges we see there. So that's a nice little thing you can do. Last thing in here, as far as the actual cutting goes, is this join small pieces option in the advanced tab. And now this is actually a node of itself in my toolkit, so you don't have to do this here, but I'll just go ahead and I'll show what it is. If you check it on, it's basically going to start combining any piece that's too small. This is your threshold size, and sometimes you'll get really, really small pieces. Like, and that one's not necessarily crazy small, but sometimes you get like really small pieces, and if they're too small, they could cause issues in your sim or later down the line when you're trying to make proxy geometry or when you're trying to fracture geometry again. So this is just gonna kind of clamp together any piece that is too big or like above this threshold size. So you can turn that on, you don't have to. And yeah, that is how the fractures of this work. Now I'm going to show you the repair input Geo tab and why it's important. This geometry that we're using right now is nice and clean and perfect, and most of the time we're not going to get stuff like this. Most of the time, whatever you're trying to fracture is going to be kind of detailed, and you're probably going to have a lot of issues with it. So to do an example, because I know this causes an issue, I'm going to change the mode of this test geometry pig to hard. And one of the big reasons why this is going to cause issues is if I drop a for each connected piece and I do a single pass in here, you can see that these aren't all connected anymore. The eyes are disconnected from the rest of the body, and that's causing issues because we have this big open edge in the mouth, and we have these open edges in the eyes. And that can cause a lot of issues when fracturing, and we'll see it hopefully here. Sample through some of these seeds to see. I'm sure we'll get one somewhere. Yeah, okay, so there's one. Sometimes when we're Boolean fracturing and our geometry isn't perfect like this, we'll get this weird thing where if the cutter is maybe going halfway through something, or there's uneven polygons, or there's really just something that's bugging out the fracture, we'll get this thing where instead of the fractured geometry, it actually is going to send through the cutter geo and leave these big empty holes in here, which is obviously not what we want and really not ideal. So I have this repair input geo tab in here, and all this is inside of the node there is a series of these switches that will enable these controllers for you before the fracture takes place. So I'll go ahead and I'll show you what some of these do. The polyfill is just going to polyfill any of these edges. I think with this fracture, that's actually enough to fix this, just because it's going to fill out those, like the mouth and the eyes and all that stuff. That won't always be enough. So you can VDB remesh after the polyfill, which this is probably the most destructive way to fix this, because you're not going to be able to keep any of your attributes and all that stuff. But this polyfill and VDB remesh combined is almost always a surefire way to make this work. I would keep this as your last resort, but it's there and it's built in if you need it. As you check on tabs, you will get their operator options down here, and these are just the same options that you would get on the actual node itself. So then you have options for a clean sub, which I have these settings set up for the best settings to fix Boolean issues. However, if this doesn't work or causes issues, you can try the Poly Doctor, or just a remesh node in general might fix some of your issues. Again, on the Poly Doctor, I have the best settings checked on, at least in my experience. You can mess around with some of changing some of these settings. Sometimes I don't know what kind of geometry you're running into this, but really this tab is just for making sure that your geometry is prepped and ready for fracture, so you don't get issues like this. That's pretty much the gist of the easy fracture, and this is going to be the first node that you'll drop down in your setup. But all of these work in tandem with each other, or at least the ones you'll use mostly is the easy fracture, easy sub fracture, and you always want to use this easy RBD configure. So I will continue down the path of how we would get this going. I'll go ahead and I'll just clean up and delete these. Straighten this out. So we have our easy fracture, and we also have the constraints from that, and I'm going to make sure that there's no tiny pieces. So I'm just going to drop down the easy join pieces. Even though there is an option on that node, I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to plug in the fracture and the fracture constraints, turn off the delete color, can check on visualize old pieces to see the old pieces that are there. And basically this is just combining anything that's less than 0.05, and it's also combining the constraints. Okay, so I'm actually going to pull this down just a little bit more, maybe 0.02, and then I'm going to run a easy sub fracture, and the sub fracture is actually going to create new constraints because it doesn't need to hold on to the old ones. So if you plug in the fracture geo, immediately you should see that we have more fractures. And now the sub fracture actually uses a Voronoi subfracture instead of the Boolean method, because it's super quick. And since when you're working with smaller pieces, you typically don't need the detail that you would get on the Boolean fracture. So it's really nice to run this a bunch of times over kind of really smaller setups. This is still probably a little bit big for it, but it's fine for what I'm doing here. So the subfracture is basically just scattering some points over the entire thing. To start out with, it takes a scatter, and then it scatters a bunch of points over the whole mesh. You can control these scatter settings here, but this amount of fractures tab down here is going to control the maximum amount of points that it's going to keep per piece. And so here we have it set to 15. And then we also, since we're scattering these points, we have a bunch of these points, and then we isolate a piece. So let's say we isolate. Okay, so let's say we're using this piece here. We're saying inside of this easy fracture, the maximum distance a point can be away from this piece is 8. So it's going to array these points onto the piece. And if it's farther away than 8, then it's not going to do it. This workflow is based on the idea that you actually use this. It's not as important if you just plug it in right away. But if you have these custom scatter points, it's going to override whatever scatter you run here. And that's nice in cases where, let's say, here, I'll actually show you my workflow that I do a lot. So I have this sphere, and let's visualize this as well. And let's say I have this sphere animated to be something like I have it going from here to, I'll just change this to 20, goes from here to here, and maybe it goes down a little bit too. So I want the majority of fractures to happen inside of this area where it's actually getting hit. So what I often do is I will take points from volume just to get some of those points on the inside, and then I'll do a solver, and all I'm going to do in here is I'm just going to merge previous frame with the current frame, and then just kind of let this go. Do a time shift to kind of lock this to the last frame. So now I have all these points that represents where this object is actually going to hit. And now if I plug that into the second input, it's going to give me a lot more fractures in that area. And it's not going to waste time with these fractures over there, because it's saying the maximum distance that you can even be is 8 from wherever you are. So if we have a piece down here and these points aren't that close to it, or maybe we have a piece down here and none of these points are within that threshold range, then it's not even going to bother with fracturing this area down here, because it's going to delete all those points and we're not going to get any new fractures there. So it's going to basically optimize how this is set up for you. So that's what happens when you use the custom scatter points tab. And then just like in the easy fracture tab, we have this interior detail option over here. I'm going to go ahead and use the exploded view as soon as this turns on. And then if I use exploded view, you can see that we are getting nice interior details and no real issues on the topology level. Okay, so then the last few of these nodes that I want to show, I think this sums up the subfracture. I mean, you're supposed to run this over something that's already been fractured, and it's supposed to be pretty easy to just get a bunch of extra little pieces. So now that we do that, if we do an easy split by piece size, show you what this is. So this is going to split the pieces into these two outputs. And if we merge both of these together, we should get the exact same thing. So you can see there's no difference. What this is doing is this is saying in the left output, we are going to output everything else. In the right output, we're going to visualize everything that is inside this range. So it has to be above 0.05 and below 2. Or actually, I think I might have these mixed up. I think that, yeah, so this is everything. So the first input, my bad, for the first output is everything that has an area size below 1 and above 0.05. So this way you can isolate specific kind of pieces and then run fractures or run details and do your own stuff to just these pieces, and then you can merge them back together. So let's say, for example, in this setup, I want to work on every piece that I think is too big. So I want to fracture the pieces that I think are too large. Run that, and then I'll do my subfracture. I'll turn off the fuse. I actually think I forgot to go over the fuse. So the fuse here on this easy fracture, sorry, didn't mean to skip over that. So on these scatter points, sometimes you'll get points that are so close to each other that fracturing in that area might actually cause too small of a cut, or it might cause some issues, because sometimes you'll literally be on top itself, and it might cause something infinitely small or something. So the fuse is just there to fuse any points together that are way too close. I actually think the default value of 0.1 might be too high, but it's there to make sure you're not getting those issues. All right, so I like that, and then I'll merge these together, and now I have more detail in these bigger areas, at least around where I care about. Okay, let's go ahead and kind of finish up this last little tool in toolkit and then run this into a sim. So I would go up to easy destruction, and then the one we want to kind of finish this off with is the easy RBD configure. And now the easy RBD configure is similar to the RBD configure that comes with Houdini, but it has a few extra things in it that are vital to an RBD sim. Biggest thing being this collision proxy that's in here. First things first, I'm actually going to change this to a higher value because this might take a second, but it's something you have to do anyways. So I'll show you what is happening here. All right, and to show you what's happening here, I'm going to go ahead and isolate one of these pieces. So I'll do a for each connected piece, and then I'm just going to isolate a single passes. I'll browse through these to see if I can't get a better piece. Okay, so that one's fine. Bullet wants to use convex hulls as collisions, and a convex hull is an object that has no concave angles on it, so nothing is actually going in. So you can see that it's kind of wrapped around this object, but we have a lot of issues if we were to use this as collision geometry because things go inside. And this is what Bullet will set up by default if you don't have this the setup that I have in this RBD configure. And the way we get around that and actually get this geometry working well is to use something called a convex decomposition. And that is going to create a bunch of separate disconnected objects that are all concave. So everything that's here is convex, but there's a bunch of them to make up this larger object. So the lower you crank this max concavity, the more detail you're going to get, but also the longer it's going to take to calculate this, and also the more collision geometry you're putting into your simulation. So whatever you think is the lowest or the highest number, I guess, that you can get away with is probably your ideal setup there. So that's what this max concavity is over here. I'm going to set these back to default because I was doing some stuff while I was not recording a second ago. But okay, so this is our geometry right now. I think I might just go ahead, just to make this easier, I might just run this all in through the subfracture and just delete everything else. So I'll take the fracture geometry into the fracture geo input, and then the second input is the constraints, and then this third input is a bounding box. You don't need to worry about that right now. I'll show you what that does in a second. But if I calculate this, it's going to look the same because the geometry output is our visualization geometry, which is what you'd see in the render and what you'd see everywhere else. But if you go over to the proxy geometry, that is where we're creating these collision proxies, and this is really what the simulation is going to be using. So you can see the higher we go, the less detail we get. This isn't exact, but this is roughly what Bullet would be creating by default if you did not use this. So I'll just go back down to something like 0.05. I'm fine with that. And then let's plug this into a bullet sim. So I'll just do RBD bullet sim or bullet solver. And we'll plug proxy geometry into proxy geometry, constraint geometry into constraint geometry, and geometry into geometry. I'll go ahead and I'll create a ground plane here just so we can see it smash against something. If I drop this, everything should be set up correctly. And this is set up correctly, actually. The constraints might just be a little too high for the moment. So I'll show you in the RBD configure in the constraints tab. By default, it's set to glue, and the strength is set to 1000. You can set that to lower, and it'll decrease the strength connecting these pieces. Yeah, so that's how you do that. And if you wanted to visualize your geometry representation, which would be the proxies, you can just check on this show geometry representation, and you should be able to see roughly what the collision geometry is looking like inside of these pieces here. But also, just an FYI, the constraints that this subfracture creates, they're not lines, they're hinges. So they're points, and you won't be able to see them by default, but they are there. So last thing is this bounding box input. If I have a box, say, I move that box, something like that, and I plug that into our bound, and let's say I do active, and I say, so everything that is going to be inside of this box is going to be active. Everything outside of it is going to be inactive. And to test this, I'm just going to do a blast. If I plug the blast into the first output and I do active equals 1, blast waypoints, it's not going to work because it's not applying those attributes there. It's applying these attributes onto the proxy geometry because that's actually what's getting simmed. So if I plug that into the third input now, you should be able to see if I delete non-selected, everything that has active 1 is getting deleted. And if I move this around, I have full control over some of these parameters here just by using the bound. You can also set all your constraints to like brick, concrete, whatever, wood. Some of these might not work perfect just because this literally is a this literally is the RBD Configure node inside of here. If really something's not performing right, you can just allow editing of contents. All you would do is you'd allow editing of contents, jump in here, and then you should get all your control over this RBD configure. And then to rematch, if you wanted to, just match current definition. Do not save node type because that'll save over the HDA definition. And this, if you match current definition, will reset everything to the defaults for the HDA. So if you have to make some edits in here, just leave this open and then plug this into the RBD simulation, and you should be good. And yeah, so that's the tool here. So oh, I need to check on use bounds. My bad. Yeah, so now this thing's just floating because of that. Let's see what happens if I crank up this force. Maybe in the breaking thresholds, I go force threshold 1. Maybe I do blue. Oh, there we go. So now we're starting to see some stuff kind of fall apart here. I'm gonna go back to standard constraints. 001. I'm also going to go ahead and in this constraints tab, really lower this. I'm going to also change the bounding box. I'm just kind of playing around here at this point. So yeah, and then if I was to invert this, so I'd say active 0, then everything else would be 1 and the rest of the head would fall. So yeah, so that's how you would go about using these tools. Hopefully this helped, and hopefully you learned a bit about this destruction workflow. Again, these are all available on my Patreon for a 1-month $5 subscription. I have a lot of other videos up there too, as well as some other tools. I'd hope it's worth it. The link's going to be in my bio or in the description for this video. So thanks for watching.